Thank you all for joining us for this special presentation brought by KERA and Alliance Child and Family Solutions, along with Rebirth Equity Alliance and Mindful. We're so excited that you're joining us tonight for discussion on race and racism. And like Amanda Gorman said at the end of that segment, the more we talk about these things, the better it is. So we're going to start out by doing an introduction, the same way they did in this clip. So what's something that's different about yourself that you love that is different while you give your introduction? So starting with Dr. Dixon.
Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Brian Dixon. I'm a child psychiatrist over in Fort Worth, and I'm the owner of Mindful, which helps to take care of little ones and big ones and everybody in between. So one of the things that I love about me is my gray hair, because it reminds me that I'm working really hard.
All right, so Camille, give us your introduction and something you like that's different about you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Camille Davis-Hayes. I'm the Director of Operations with Alliance Child and Family Solutions. Something that's different about me that I just love, my thick, coarse hair.
Perfect. Now, last but not least, Miss Jen. So we'll come back to you, Jen. Looks like your mic is off. But Jen is the president and co-founder of Rebirth Equity Alliance. And tell us what you like that's different about you.
I love my dimples. They are expressive for me in some situations when I can't be as expressive as I want to be, and I love that about them.
Very nice. So we heard a little bit about what makes each of us different and the best part of being different. And so what would you suggest that kids do if they see someone that's being treated differently, but not in a good way because of the color of their skin? So Jen, leading to you again.
Okay, what would I do? I think that if someone was being treated differently for the color of their skin, I want to know that there is accountability and there is someone for me to like feel safe reporting that to. And so I think it's so important that we know that the structures that our like youth and our kids have in place and the adults that they have to speak to are like plentiful and safe. And that, you know, they have access to the power structures that affect their day-to-day lives. And so if I see someone treating someone differently because of their skin color, I want to know that, you know, that concern can be addressed from the system perspective, and that everyone can address that concern together as a community, and that I'm not alone in addressing that concern.
So Dr. Dixon, I know you do a lot of community organizing and working with all ages. So when you're working with adults that maybe feel powerless of how to address issues of race and racism, how would you tackle that issue?
Well, I think it's really great that we can speak about this important topic, both for kids and adults. And one thing that is equally true, which is we are creatures of hope, right? So when we're born, we want to have the most amazing things happen during the time that we're on this earth. And as we get older, we tend to forget that. And so that's one of the great gifts about being around kids, is that they remind us that we don't have to see skin color as a bad thing. It can be something that's different and wonderful. And so I would, in working with adults, I constantly remind them, you are wonderful, you are light, right? We are made of the same things that stars are made of, which is kind of cool when you think about it. And so, yeah, so don't take yourself so seriously. If you've done something wrong, if you've said something wrong, apologize. It's okay to say, I'm sorry, and to try to do better. And then just remember the spirit of kids, because kids are light and love and hope. And so remember those things.
Great suggestions. And so Camille, I'm going to toss to you in a second, but one of the questions is, we've heard a little bit about how to interact with adults, how to interact with children, but what does this look like in the workplace if we are hearing people that are treating others unfairly and maybe they're not sure that they'll have that structural support? What should people do when they hear about racism?
I think people should first be patient and understand and just listen. That's the foundation for communication and open dialogue with one another. So I think in the workplace, it is to basically put all the cultures out there, be able to understand that there are inherent differences among people, and be open and understanding to be able to dialogue and learn more about the different cultures that are inherent in the workplace.
Very good. And so one of the things that really stuck out to me from this segment was that we start understanding when we start noticing, and that's how we make the world a better place. And so one of the questions I'll ask to each of you, and I'll share my own experience with this as well, is when did you first notice race, or how did your kids first notice race? For me, I'm part of a blended family, and we have multiple races. And although we've talked about race, it's one of those things that I wasn't quite sure my children noticed until we happened to be at a Martin Luther King Jr. Day parade. And they said, we're celebrating him because now I can go to school with people that look like you, Mommy. And to me, it just was such a striking difference, because as much as sometimes we say we don't want to talk about those differences and only the ways that we're the same, it meant a lot to me to see my children see differences. And I do a disservice when I don't point out those differences and how they make us special. And so I'm going to jump over to Jen. What are some ways that either you first learned about race, or that you've taught your kids, or that they've noticed?
I think that the ability to like not notice race is what's outside of outside of like the normal experience, or like the experience that is like traumatizing generations of people, right? I didn't ever have a point where I didn't notice race, and my children didn't have that point either. It's always been a discussion in our household. It's always been something that they've known about themselves. And code switching, which is like when kids like change, or when people change their behaviors or their mannerisms or their any number of things about themselves for any number of reasons, but sometimes to integrate into social circles or assimilate. And when you see kids doing that at such a young age, you know that they are seeing differences and they are understanding their place in the world and how these structures impact them. So really, like the best thing we can do is just like always make it a conversation, rather than have it be like a big conversation that happens just once, you know?
Perfect. So Camille, tell us about your experience.
I think I'm similar to Jen, where I don't ever remember a time in my life where, I had the experience to say that I wasn't different and didn't have to think about it. I have had conversations with my children since they were just young on, just because it's the world that we live in. It's important to have an open dialogue about it. The conversations have surely changed over the course of them growing and developing, because at 4, it was a very different conversation with my son than it was when he was 12 or 16 and so on. And I have found, being a parent of both a son and a daughter who have very different interests and things like that, the conversation shifts a very little bit, especially when we look at many things that occur in the news and things like that. The conversation with my son is a little bit different and a little bit more I don't want to say hard-nosed or stern, but just, a little bit more geared towards safety and understanding how he's viewed when he goes out into the world.
Very good. And Dr. Dixon, throwing it to you.
Yeah, so I have a unique story, I guess. I've always known it since I was in kindergarten. So what a lot of people tend to forget is that racism, especially segregation, is not that far away from us historically. And so I grew up in a small town where there was a definite line between the Black people who lived in the north part of town and the white people who lived in the south part of town. And I was actually bused from one side of the town to the other side of the town. So they took a bus load of Black kids out of the Black neighborhood. And we actually went to the elementary school that was right next to the country club. And so we would get off the bus and we would be one bus load of black kids amongst, 100 white kids. And, I had friends that were white friends, and I knew that they looked differently than I did, but they treated me the same. I didn't notice any difference. But as most black parents do, our parents were very much instructive in, okay, this is how you act, this is how you don't act, this is what you say, this is what you don't say, so that we can be safe. And so I've kind of kept that with me throughout all of my careers, going to different colleges and universities that were predominantly white. And so I think about it all the time, and I feel lucky that I can not only share my experience, but more importantly, be of a help during this time where tensions and feelings are really, really high.
That's great. Thank you for sharing your perspective for each of you. And I think you bring up a good point of sometimes when our experiences are different, we assume that it's the same for everyone externally, and we miss the fact that we may not have all grown up the same way or with the same backgrounds. So what would you suggest for how people can start to be an ally for breaking down racism and making change in the world, especially if maybe they didn't recognize it previously?
Can I go first?
Yes, you can.
So, I know that Jim and Camille feel the very same way. Talk about it. And when you talk less than you listen. So listen more than you talk. I think that it's a very helpful skill. It's a skill that itty bitties can learn. So 4 and 5 year olds can learn, teenagers can learn, and adults can learn. So I'm going to encourage everybody, especially when it's something this sensitive, is to try to listen more than you talk.
And I'm going to jump in. I want to jump in on that with the whole listen aspect, because I think sometimes in society we get stuck on listening to ourselves, our own thoughts, our own ideations, our own anxieties, things like that. And we fail to listen to the other people and their perspective. It's very easy to be a naysayer when you haven't been through those situations and things like that. And so I think being able to listen from the standpoint of putting yourself in their shoes and saying, wow, this is a different perspective. I think that is, I'm glad that Dr. Dixon brought that up, because it's a listen more than you talk. It's okay to ask questions and dialogue and things like that, but it's not okay to turn around and say, well, I've not had that experience, and invalidate that of someone else, because those experiences are valid. And that is how we will learn more about one another, is being able to listen and dialogue and share those experiences.
Yeah, and I'll go last on this one. I think that adding to what Dr. Dixon and Camille said about listening more than you talk, we have to remember that when we're talking about racism, we're talking about generations of systems that have been structured to oppress. And so something that comes along with that is like the theft of your story, right? And the ability to like own your story and the things about it, right? And so when we practice listening more than we talk, we're practicing like giving back that narrative to the community that's been impacted, right? And then your original question was about like, how can we, like talk about our allyship, I think is what you said. And something I really liked from the special was when they talked about John Lewis and Good Trouble. And I think that talking to kids about risk level, right, and their comfortability around risk level and what it means to be an accomplice. And let's talk to kids about like, what are the risks that Black folks and people of color are having to take every day without their consent, just to be, in this, to be accepted, right? And so how can we match that? And how can we take matching risks in our lives? And what do we feel safe doing? And how can we talk about that as a family? How are we matching the level of risk that people of color and Black folks are taking every day without their knowledge and without their consent, based on the systems that we've put in place?
Those are some really good points. And I like that you talk about the risk level and the safety level. Now, I heard some similar but different feedback in the sense that I know Camille mentioned that she frequently talks about safety and understanding how others might perceive you, and safety in going into situations, knowing that not all people are accepting. And so how do you balance this idea of we want to protect our kids, especially when we have children of color, we work with children of color, we want them to be safe and we want to acknowledge the risks they face, but also causing good trouble? What does that look like in a practical sense? So Dr. Dixon, I'm going to have you jump off first.
Yeah, I think one of the first things to keep in mind, so kids are like sponges. They're like microphone sponges, right? So they soak up whatever we give them, whatever auras we have, whatever energies we have, and then they give it back to you amplified. And so if you're going to make sure, if you want to teach kids about good trouble, if you want to teach them about fairness and equity and equality, you have to practice it yourself, because they're going to amplify what you give them. And so you have to do the work. I cannot stress this enough, as I'm sure everybody on the call has heard me say before, everybody needs a therapist. Everybody should have a therapist, because we all have our blind spots and we all have our shortcomings, and there's always areas for improvement. And so when it comes to racism and race and disparities and inequalities, we as the adults, we as the parents, let us do the work first. And I specifically look to my brothers and sisters who are Caucasian, because y'all are the majority. And so you have to put in the work so that then our kids and your friends and allies will feel accepted and loved.
That's great advice. What about you, Camille?
So I think to add on to what Dr. Dixon said, I think another thing is to be able to decipher, not generalize people and things like that, because we see that a lot in society now. We generalize people. And one thing that my parents, I remember a very early on lesson, was that they taught us how to decipher things with people and individuals. And just because a person does something bad, that does not make the entire race of person bad, and things like that. I think also, as Dr. Dixon said, with regard to children, we have to model that. We have to model, the ability that we're able to decipher and not generalize. We also have to model accountability. And some, admit when we're wrong, take accountability for it, strive to make a change for our children, because everyone will make mistakes. Everyone will say something off candor, inappropriate, maybe insulting or something like that. You have to be accountable. And I think that is the foundation with which our kids will be able to grow from.
Very good. And Jen?
I love that advice. I really think that examining our networks and like how we connect to each other can be a powerful tool in learning how to be a better accomplice and a better, ally. I think that we know that lack of contact and homogenous social groups are something that increase racism in our communities. So working actively to increase the level of, the level of representation in our communities is so important. Where are we making space? How are we making space for people in our communities? And then examining, how we're being involved and putting in the work, like Brian and Camille said. How are you like responsible for your practice? How are you pushing back against the dominant narrative as a parent and saying, okay, I know that everything and all of the media that I'm taking in is based on this dominant narrative. And these are the books that I'm going to buy that push back against that. This is the conversation that I'm going to have with my clinician about their continuing education that's going to push back against that. This is the conversation that I'm going to have with the administration at my child's school that's going to push back against this dominant narrative. Because when we don't work, that's when the dominant narrative is allowed to just run rampant in our communities. And that's what we don't want.
Right. Jen, let me jump in there, because she brought up a good point, that I think that we also need to change the narrative in our own families. We also need to we have a lot of race families. And we can't just go on, we have to embrace every aspect of different families and things like that. And I think a lot of times we don't do that. We just stick with the status quo or what kind of gets us to fit in well and things like that. And so we have to educate our children about, I think Jen said in another conversation that we had, is just to reject just going, and narrowing yourself into just one area or one race. Be able to say, talk about your different backgrounds, your differences, the races that are in your family and that make up who these children are, who these families are. And that will begin to normalize it. And so you're not like, oh, that person's different. No, that person and their heritage and things like that is actually a part of me.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And so when you think of having these discussions about different races and different people groups, how do you address questions from kids? Because I know we've gotten some on the Alive chat about why our race is treated unfairly. And, how do you stop that, especially as a kid, where you may not know who to go to next about it? So, Jen, I'm going to go to you.
Yay. I think that it's so important that when we talk to kids and when we think about curriculum, usually race and racism are taught as things that existed 50 years ago and no longer affect us. And I think that it's so important that we start our conversations so much further back than that, and that we build so much space in for possibility for the future, right? Like, we have to create spaces where we can dream together, and also remember that this is not something that started overnight. When we're starting those conversations with kids, again, like, my advice is to just have it be a continuous conversation. I really, really adore the advice that was given at the beginning of the special about having family meetings every night where the kids choose the topic. We do high-lows at our house every night. And I really love a dinner table tradition. So that was really cool advice. And I think that was a great piece. I'll put that in with mine too.
Yeah, I loved that. So Camille, I know you've had lots of these conversations with your kids. So what are some of the ways that you've woven that in to conversations, and how do you address issues like racism with your kids?
It's been not easy, but it has been a foundation in our family just because my husband is mixed race. So they have a grandparent who is a different race. And so very early on, when you love someone who looks different than you, is another race, things like that, it makes it a little easier. So that conversation has always been there. We do a lot of dinner table talk just about what was your day like. As my kids began matriculate through high school, there were some, incidences where it was, there was racism involved. And I let them arrive to that on their own. And the teacher did this or somebody did that. My son played organized sports and would experience it on the field and things like that. We always just talked about it. Where do you think it came from? What do you think it was born out of? Do you think that makes them a bad person? Is this something that you want to address and be persistent about and have it, something change and things like that? Be an advocate for basically giving them the information and then seeing where they to go. It's been a little bit easier with my daughter just because, again, I will say, just being a parent of, one of each, boy and a girl, it has been a little bit more of a persistent topic with my son. Just, safety and things like that, and just knowing how he carries himself and how the world views and interacts with African-American men. The conversation continues. He's in college now, and the conversation continues. And I imagine that it will continue into his adulthood, and that it'll always be something that we talk about. It was always something that I spoke about with my parents, and just getting a different perspective, because they did have generational experience that I had not yet had. So they would often offer, advice and things like that, because, things come around and they repeat themselves. History is, bound to repeat itself if we don't do anything about it. I have hope for the future. I do. I know that the things that we want often take time, but again, I'll go back to my first statement about just being patient and understanding we also have to be persistent. We can't give up out of first, and just understanding that when we are dialoguing with kids, let them lead the conversation. Sometimes the conversation would literally start, do you think this was racist? Right. And we just, we take the incident and we go with it and dissect it and, go from there.
I think that's fantastic. So Dr. Dixon, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, so this is a topic near and dear to my heart because there are other parts of being a parent and working with kids where treating this directly is important. So as I mentioned earlier, so kids, they are those microphone sponges. Well, they also know when you are uncomfortable. And so if you go into a topic like this and you're waffling or wavering and you feel very unconfident, they're going to pick up on it, and either that will make their anxiety skyrocket, or worse, they're going to start to think that they can't trust everything that you're saying. And so what I teach all of my parents, what I try to do myself, is when something this critical, this foundational comes up, is you look them in the eye and you very concretely and plainly explain, no, that's not okay. This is how it should be. This is what I'm going to do to make it better. This is what I expect of you, right? And be very, very direct. Be kind, be thoughtful, but be direct. And that goes back to, if you don't, as a parent, as an adult, if you don't feel comfortable having those conversations, it means you have more work to do. So go in and do that work. Talk to your therapist. Talk to other leaders who are working in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, so that you can go back and speak confidently on those things with the kids that you're around.
I want to say one more thing. I think that something that kids have a possibility for that is hard for us as adults to realize is they have a really unique way of dreaming. And I think that one thing that we can do that can be really powerful in this conversation is to just create space for those dreams and use them to craft the work that we're doing and the moves that we're making as we do anti-racist work together as a community, because we can't create the future that we want if we don't make space to think about it. If we're always just reacting to the last trauma and we're always just reacting to racism, we can't dream about the future. And kids are great dreamers. And so I really want to encourage families listening to this to really create space for our kids to dream about a world where we're not consistently impacted by racism.
Jen, I'm glad that you said that, because I remember being that kid. I remember dreaming, and educated in a similar environment as Dr. Dixon. I was bused into a different neighborhood and things like that. And I remember dreaming. I remember dreaming that when I had kids, that this would not be what they had, how they had to be educated and things like that. And so we have not yet arrived all the way there yet, but we have made strides towards that. And change takes a while, but we have made some changes and we're moving in the right direction. We do have to begin to remember to foster those dreams for children, because I remember them being there.
I love that. So we have to continue to work together to foster dreams, because the children are the future for our country, our society, for our families. One of the comments we got on the live chat said that John Lewis did say it best. Sometimes people don't hear the first time. And so how do you advise repeating a point, especially in the face of resistance or what some would call anti-Blackness? How do you address those points? So, Jen, I'm going to call on you.
I think that I think that it's important for us when we're talking about anti-racism to remember that we're consistently putting the work of anti-racism onto people impacted by racism, right? And so I kind of want to flip that question and say, how are like white people and the dominant culture holding each other accountable for that education? How are we compensating and crediting Black women and Black femmes for their work and Black people for their work? And how are we like researching the root of where our anti-racism work is coming from and making sure, how are we ethically as the dominant party creating conditions for Black people to thrive? And so I think that's the question that you meant to ask is the thing.
I love it. I love it. So Dr. D, bumping over to you.
Yeah, so it's, and I amen to what Jen said, because yes, we do not want to put that work back on the people who are being disproportionately affected by the effects of racism. And when it comes to kids, again, I cannot stress this enough. Anytime I'm working with kids, I always tell them that they have two jobs, which is to listen to whoever's taking care of them and do well in school. So just focus on those things. And so that means that all the other heavy lifting has to be done by the caregivers, by the grandmas and grandpas, the systems that we work in, as Jen was referring to. So the system, the healthcare systems, the educational systems, the governmental systems, and those are all adults. And so at the end of the day, back to something Jen said as well, if you look at your network and you don't have any Black people in your network, we need to talk, because at the end of the day, you're missing out on a great opportunity to learn more and to share more and to be more. And so I'm going to say that if something's not working, it is your responsibility as adults listening to this conversation. It is your responsibility to go and do the work. And I will help where I can, but it's the lift is yours.
Very good. Camille, your thoughts?
I have not much to add to that other than, like Jen said in the beginning, we need to shore up the systems so we have places where people can go to for things like that, because it can't be relied upon us to be able to provide that. Just like they said, heavy lifting. We're doing enough day to day, just living it.
Yes, well said. And so I know we're coming close to the end of our time. And so with that, there will be an email address at the end that you'll get to send questions that all of us can respond to. So we would love to keep this dialogue going, because again, this is just the start of something for how to pay it forward, for how to involve our communities. So I want to go to each panelist with one last takeaway. So for those that joined and heard these really valuable conversations that parents had with kids and that Daniel Tiger had with his friends, what is your one thing that you hope people will get from this talk today? So Camille, back to you.
Embrace differences as a parent. Embrace your children, embracing the differences of others. Don't be a restrictive parent, have all sorts of, races come to your home, genders, things like that. Be open to that. Let your kids flourish and kind of explore on their own. They will make a foundational environment at your home where it's open dialogue, open conversation, things like that. Don't probe. Help them learn how to decipher, not generalize about different races, things like that, but just be open, be available, be accessible as a parent.
All right, so Jen, what are your thoughts?
I think that one takeaway that I always get from listening to conversations with children is that they already know is the thing. Like, you think that you're holding back this conversation and they've already had it. They had it with themselves because you wouldn't have it. So like, have it. And it might be scary, but it can be scary together, and and you can talk about the scary, and that's also natural. Emotion is a natural response to oppression. And so I think that this was a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Dixon.
And an offshoot of what Jen just said, absolutely. So kids already know it. So every child has a concept of fairness. It's almost inherent to human beings, just the way they were made. And so if you violate that sense of fairness, you're going to have to pay for it. So be fair, be open, be accepting. And at the end of the day, be forgiving. So of yourself and of the people you're around. And so kids, when you make a mistake, just say you're sorry. Kids are incredibly forgiving, and they have unconditional love. And so I hope that parents take away that spark of hope from our conversation today.
Absolutely. So I know as we give a couple final comments here, one of the things that I heard is how we need to all work together to build up our children, create a safe space, and that the more we talk about these difficult conversations, the more our children will feel comfortable approaching us, and the easier it will be for them. If we do have things that are difficult, I know there's a great agency, Alliance Child and Family Solutions, offering counseling where you can have that therapist, or you can see a psychiatrist with Dr. Dixon or his crew at Mindful. And you can also get your organization to participate in anti-racism training and diversity training with Rebirth Equity Alliance. I know it was incredibly enlightening for our group when we went through it. And one of those things that you can't get enough education in this, because again, we have to keep the conversation going. So I'm going to toss it back to Danita to close us out for tonight.
Thank you to our moderator and panelists for sharing your time and insight with us this evening. If we were unable to answer your question today, please reach out to us via email at engage@kera.org, and we'll be happy to provide a response. We thank all of our attendees for joining us for this very important conversation. Please enjoy the remainder of your night. Goodbye.